When I returned from my hip replacement surgery to find all my possessions stuffed into garbage bags on the front porch, I realized my nephew's insistence on becoming my caretaker during recovery was never about my welfare. It was a calculated plan to seize my home and savings of 45 years. What Richard hadn't counted on was that my 30-year career as a real estate attorney had taught me exactly how to identify property fraud, or that Commissioner Vivian Martinez, who now headed the county's Elder Services Division, would immediately recognize the classic exploitation pattern when I presented my meticulously organized evidence, ultimately leading to a resolution that restored not just my beloved craftsman cottage, but established precedent protecting vulnerable seniors throughout our state. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because next week, I'm sharing crucial information about power of attorney documents that everyone over 60 needs to understand. My name is Eleanor Thompson, and at 74, I've learned that sometimes the people who claim to care for you the most are actually calculating what they can take from you. For over 3 decades, I served as a real estate attorney at Westridge Legal Partners, where I specialized in property disputes and title issues, often representing elderly clients whose property rights were being threatened or manipulated. This expertise would become unexpectedly crucial in my own life when I found myself facing homelessness at the hands of my own family. I purchased my craftsman cottage on Magnolia Lane in 1978, shortly after finalizing my divorce from William. It was a difficult time in my life. I was 48, starting over, and determined to create a stable home where my daughter Patricia could visit during college breaks. The house wasn't much when I bought it: peeling paint, a neglected garden, and outdated fixtures throughout. But it had beautiful bones, including original hardwood floors, a river rock fireplace, and stained glass windows in the dining room that cast rainbows across the walls when the afternoon sun hit just right. Over the decades, I lovingly restored every inch of that 1920s cottage. I spent weekends stripping layers of old wallpaper, learning to repair plaster walls, and gradually bringing back the home's original charm. The wraparound porch became my sanctuary. I installed a porch swing, where I enjoyed my morning coffee and watched the neighborhood change around me. The garden evolved into a showpiece of native plants and heritage roses, many propagated from cuttings shared by neighbors who became dear friends over the years. My home wasn't just a financial investment, though its value had increased tenfold since my purchase. It represented my independence, my resilience, and the life I had carefully built for myself after my marriage ended. Every corner held memories: the kitchen where I'd taught Patricia to make my grandmother's bread recipes, the study where I prepared countless cases for court, the sunroom where I hosted monthly book club meetings with friends I'd known for decades. After retiring at 70, I remained active in the legal community, occasionally consulting on complex property cases and volunteering twice weekly at the WAY Senior Legal Aid Clinic, helping elderly citizens with housing issues and estate planning. I found deep satisfaction in using my expertise to protect vulnerable seniors from predatory practices, never imagining I would soon face similar threats myself. The situation that would ultimately lead to finding my possessions in garbage bags began innocuously enough. At 73, I remained fiercely independent, in excellent health for my age, and deeply connected to my community. Patricia had built her life in Seattle, visiting a few times yearly with her husband and teenage sons. Our relationship was warm but distant, separated by both geography and her demanding career in hospital administration. My nephew Richard, my late brother Edward's son, lived just 30 minutes away. At 42, his life appeared to be at a crossroads. After losing his job in commercial real estate during the economic downturn, he had struggled to reestablish himself. His marriage had ended, and he had moved into a small apartment while reassessing his options, as he put it during our occasional family gatherings. Our relationship had never been particularly close. Edward and I had drifted apart after our parents died, and I knew Richard more as a distant relative than as a nephew with whom I shared meaningful connection. I was therefore surprised when he began visiting more frequently about 8 months ago, bringing coffee and asking thoughtful questions about my life and legal career. "Aunt Ellie, I've always admired how you built your career while maintaining such an amazing home," he remarked during one such visit, glancing appreciatively around my living room. "This neighborhood has become so desirable. You must have developers knocking down your door with offers." "Occasionally," I acknowledged, "but this is my home, not an investment property. I intend to age in place as long as possible." Richard nodded understandingly. "That's becoming more common." "Have you made accessibility modifications? Those porch steps could become challenging if you ever had mobility issues." His concern seemed genuine, and I explained the home modifications I'd already implemented: a first-floor bedroom suite, grab bars in the bathrooms, and improved lighting throughout. I had carefully planned to remain in my home independently for many years to come. These visits increased in frequency over several months. Richard began offering to help with small household tasks, replacing light bulbs in high fixtures, trimming branches that hung over the roof, organizing my basement storage. His assistance was convenient, though not necessary, and I viewed his renewed interest in family connection positively. In retrospect, the warning signs were there, but I failed to recognize them, perhaps because I never expected exploitation from family. Richard's questions gradually shifted toward financial matters: my retirement accounts, whether I had long-term care insurance, how I managed home maintenance costs on a fixed income. Each question was framed as concern, but now I recognize the systematic information gathering for what it was. "Have you updated your will recently, Aunt Ellie?" he asked during a Sunday dinner I'd prepared. "Patricia being so far away could complicate things if you ever had a health emergency." "My estate planning is current and comprehensive," I assured him, not elaborating on details I considered private. "My attorney, Margaret Chen, reviews everything annually." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "It's just that Seattle is a 5-hour flight away. If something happened suddenly, you'd need someone local to manage things. Have you considered appointing a healthcare proxy here in town?" The suggestion wasn't unreasonable. Patricia's distance did create practical challenges for emergency situations. When Richard offered himself as a potential local contact for emergencies, I didn't immediately dismiss the idea, though I explained that my neighbor Grace, a retired nurse, already checked in regularly and held a spare key. "Family has certain legal advantages in emergency situations," Richard pointed out. "Hospitals and doctors often restrict information unless you're next of kin or formally designated." This conversation occurred several times, with Richard gradually introducing the concept of granting him limited power of attorney just for emergencies. Each time I deflected, explaining that my legal documents were in order and that Margaret had ensured all contingencies were covered. What changed this careful dynamic was an unexpected health crisis. One morning, while gardening, I lost my balance on the stone path and fell awkwardly, feeling a sickening pain in my hip. My neighbor Grace heard my calls for help and immediately came to my aid. X-rays confirmed a fractured hip requiring surgery and several weeks of rehabilitation. Richard appeared at the hospital within hours of my admission, displaying appropriate concern and immediately positioning himself as my primary family contact. To the medical staff, despite my having listed Grace as my emergency contact, "Patricia is booking a flight, but it will be a few days before she can arrange coverage at work," he explained, setting a small overnight bag on the visitor's chair. "I've brought your toiletries and phone charger. Is there anything else you need?" His attentiveness seemed like a blessing during a vulnerable time. When the orthopedic surgeon explained that I would need at least 2 weeks in a rehabilitation facility followed by home care during recovery, Richard immediately stepped forward. "I've been researching rehabilitation options," he informed me, producing a brochure for Lakeside Recovery Center. "They have an excellent physical therapy program and private rooms. I've already spoken with your insurance representative about coverage. His efficiency was both impressive and slightly disconcerting. I hadn't authorized him to speak with my insurance company, yet he had somehow managed to do so. When I mentioned this, he waved away my concern. They just needed to verify. You had coverage for skilled nursing care. I explained I was helping you navigate the options. No personal information was discussed. The explanation seemed reasonable, especially while I was dealing with post-surgical pain and medication effects. Patricia called daily but couldn't leave. Her position immediately, planning to visit once I was settled in rehabilitation. In her absence, Richard's assistance seemed providential. 3 days after surgery, as discharge planning began, the hospital social worker discussed my transition to rehabilitation and eventual return home. You'll need significant home modifications for safe recovery, she explained. Temporary ramps. For entryways, a hospital bed on the first floor, bathroom modifications. All essential before you can safely return home. Before I could respond, Richard interjected, I've been researching companies that specialize in adaptive renovations, but Aunt Ellie, most will take weeks to schedule and complete. Your insurance has limited coverage for extended rehabilitation. Stays. He had clearly prepared for this conversation, presenting a carefully constructed problem with an implied solution he had yet to offer. The social worker nodded sympathetically at the dilemma. There is another option, Richard suggested, appearing to formulate the idea spontaneously. You could stay with me during recovery. My apartment has elevator access and a walk-in shower. I could work remotely for a few weeks to help with your initial recovery. The offer seemed genuinely altruistic, though staying in his one-bedroom apartment hardly seemed practical. However, Richard had anticipated this objection. Actually, I've been considering moving back into a house. This might be the perfect opportunity to find something suitable for both your recovery and my fresh start. Perhaps we could arrange a temporary situation. You provide some housing security for me, and I provide the care you need during recovery. The social worker, not privy to our family dynamics or my financial situation, enthusiastically endorsed this family care solution as ideal. I felt cornered, uncomfortable with both the arrangement and the pressure being applied while I was still heavily medicated and vulnerable. I appreciate the offer, Richard, but I'd prefer to explore professional home care options. My long-term care insurance should cover... I've actually already checked with your insurance, Richard interrupted smoothly. They'll cover limited home health visits but not 24-hour care, which you'll initially need. The out-of-pocket costs would be substantial. How had he accessed my insurance details to this degree? The question floated in my medication-fogged mind but didn't fully crystallize into the alarm it should have triggered. The social worker, pressing for discharge solutions, was clearly relieved by Richard's apparent solution to a complex situation. Family care is always preferable when available, she affirmed, and it would expedite your discharge significantly. Feeling pressured and without Patricia's input, she had been unable to join discharge planning calls due to her work schedule, I reluctantly agreed to consider Richard's offer, though I insisted on consulting with my attorney before making any formal arrangements. Of course, Richard agreed readily. I'm just trying to provide options during a difficult time. We can discuss details once you're settled at Lakeside. The rehabilitation facility provided excellent physical therapy, but I found the environment disorienting and institutional. Richard visited daily, bringing small comforts from home and gradually introducing documentation he claimed was necessary for insurance and healthcare coordination. The social worker mentioned you'll need a temporary healthcare proxy while you're in rehabilitation, he explained, presenting a document during his third visit. This just gives me limited authority to coordinate with your healthcare providers during recovery. The document he presented was indeed a standard healthcare proxy form, which seemed reasonable given the circumstances. What I failed to notice, in my compromised state, was that he had included an additional page that granted him durable power of attorney for property management during periods of incapacity. When I hesitated, Richard adopted a concerned expression. "Aunt Ellie, is your pain medication making it difficult to focus? We can review this tomorrow if you'd prefer." This subtle suggestion that my cognitive abilities might be compromised became a recurring theme. When I requested time to have Margaret review the documents, Richard expressed concern about delays affecting your care coordination and subtly implied that my insistence indicated problematic confusion. "The rehabilitation director mentioned you seemed disoriented during night checks," he commented. "They're monitoring for possible medication side effects or post-surgical confusion. Delaying necessary paperwork might raise concerns about your decision-making capacity." The implied threat was clear though expertly veiled. Cooperate or risk being deemed incapacitated. Still, I insisted on having Margaret review everything before signing. "Margaret is on vacation for 2 weeks," Richard informed me the following day. "I called her office to arrange a consultation, but they said she's unavailable. We can't wait that long to arrange your home care transition." This information, which I would later discover was entirely fabricated, removed my trusted legal counsel from the equation at the most critical juncture. Without Margaret's guidance and still struggling with pain and medication side effects, I reluctantly signed the documents Richard presented, believing they were limited to healthcare coordination during my rehabilitation stay. Meanwhile, Richard reported making arrangements for my eventual return home. "I've scheduled an assessment for the necessary home modifications," he explained. "The contractor says the work will take at least 3 weeks, which aligns with your projected rehabilitation timeline." Patricia finally visited during my second week at Lakeside, staying for 3 days before returning to Seattle. Her brief presence provided welcome relief, though Richard maintained his role as primary coordinator of my care and discharge planning. During her visit, he presented himself as the selfless nephew stepping in to manage a family crisis, a performance Patricia seemed to accept without question, given her limited time and immediate need to return to her responsibilities. "Richard has been amazing," she told me before departing. "I don't know how we'd manage without him coordinating everything locally. Are you sure you don't want to come stay with us in Seattle during recovery? The boys would love having you." The offer was tempting, but impractical. My medical care, support, network, and home were all here. Patricia's busy household with active teenagers hardly seemed conducive to post-surgical recovery for a 74-year-old woman. More importantly, I had no intention of leaving my home for an extended period. "I appreciate the offer, dear, but my recovery will be better served in familiar surroundings. Richard is arranging the necessary modifications, and I should be home in another week or so." Patricia accepted this decision, expressing gratitude for Richard's assistance before returning to Seattle with promises to call daily and return for a longer visit once I was settled at home. As my discharge date approached, Richard's visits became briefer and focused increasingly on paperwork. He brought documents he claimed were necessary for insurance coverage of home modifications and equipment, which I signed without thorough review, trusting his representations about their purpose and content. "The home modifications are on schedule," he reported. "I've arranged for the hospital bed to be delivered to your living room and hired a home health aide for the first 2 weeks after discharge. Everything's coming together perfectly." His efficient management of these complex arrangements seemed to confirm that his involvement was indeed motivated by genuine concern for my welfare. The rehabilitation staff clearly viewed him as a model family caregiver, praising his attentiveness and organizational skills. 2 days before my scheduled discharge, Richard arrived with news that would dramatically alter our arrangements. "There's been an unexpected development," he began, his expression carefully neutral. "The contractor discovered significant structural issues during the bathroom modification installation. The floor joists beneath your bathroom show extensive water damage and termite activity that compromise the entire structure." He produced photographs showing rotted wood and insect damage. "The contractor says it's unsafe to proceed without addressing." these structural issues first, which will require opening walls and floors throughout the bathroom and possibly adjacent areas. The news was concerning but not entirely surprising in a century-old home. What followed, however, was, "I've spoken with my landlord, and he's agreed to let me out of my lease early," Richard continued. "I've found a rental house in Oak Park, with first-floor accessibility features already installed. It's available immediately, which solves our immediate problem perfectly." The solution seemed too convenient, too perfectly aligned with his earlier suggestion about shared housing. Still, with discharge imminent and no alternate arrangements in place, I found myself with few options. "This would be temporary, of course," I clarified. "Just until the structural repairs are completed at my house." "Absolutely," Richard agreed readily. "I estimate 4 to 6 weeks for the major work, though it could extend if they find additional damage. The rental has a 6-month minimum lease, but that gives us flexibility for your recovery without rushing the repairs." With discharge scheduled for the following day and no alternate plan in place, I reluctantly agreed to this temporary arrangement. Richard brought additional documents authorizing him to coordinate home repair estimates and insurance claims related to the structural damage, which again seemed reasonable given the circumstances. The morning of my discharge, Richard arrived with clothing he'd retrieved from my home. Basic items packed in a small suitcase rather than the garbage bags that would later appear. He explained that many of my personal items had been placed in storage units to protect them during the extensive renovation work. The contractors needed to remove everything from the bathroom and adjacent bedroom to access the damaged areas, he explained. "I've cataloged everything and stored it securely. We can retrieve anything specific you need." My discharge from rehabilitation proceeded smoothly, with transportation to the Oak Park rental house Richard had secured. The property was a modest, ranch-style home in a declining neighborhood, far from my beloved Magnolia Lane, but equipped with the accessibility features essential for my recovery. "It's not fancy, but it's functional for your recovery needs," Richard explained as he helped me navigate the entrance ramp. "And the price was right, which helps manage expenses during this unexpected situation." The interior was sparsely furnished, with basic rental-grade furniture and a hospital bed in what appeared to be a converted dining room. My personal belongings were noticeably absent, with Richard explaining that he'd bring additional items from storage as needed. For the first week, the arrangement proceeded without major incident. A home health nurse visited daily to manage wound care and medication, while a physical therapist came 3 times weekly to continue my rehabilitation exercises. Richard appeared each evening after work, preparing simple meals and managing household necessities. During this time, I made repeated requests to visit my home and assess the renovation progress myself. "The construction site is completely inaccessible right now," Richard deflected. "They've removed flooring and opened walls. It's not safe, especially given your mobility limitations." When I insisted on at least driving by to see the exterior, Richard became noticeably uncomfortable. "The contractor parks his equipment in the driveway, blocking the view from the street," he explained. "And the neighborhood has had some vandalism issues recently. I'd rather not leave the house sitting obviously unoccupied while construction is underway." These explanations seemed plausible, yet somehow evasive. I began requesting specific personal items, photo albums, my mother's quilts, particular clothing, only, to be told they were in storage units, currently inaccessible due to the renovation staging. My attempts to contact Margaret Chen directly were similarly frustrated. Calls to her office were intercepted by Richard, who insisted on managing all communication related to the home repairs to maintain clear documentation for insurance purposes. When I used the home health aide phone to call Margaret directly, I discovered her number had been blocked, a technical glitch Richard attributed to the prepaid phone he'd provided for my use during recovery. The critical moment of clarity came 3 weeks after my discharge from rehabilitation. The home health aide, Sophia, had become increasingly concerned about the limitations placed on my communication and access to personal belongings. "Ms. Thompson, something doesn't seem right about this situation," she confided during one of Richard's Absences. Would you like to use my personal phone to contact anyone? Using Sophia's phone, I finally reached Margaret Chen, whose shocked response to my situation was immediate and alarming. "Eleanor, I've been trying to reach you for weeks," she exclaimed. "I never received any messages from Richard, nor am I on vacation. More concerning, there's been unusual activity regarding your property that triggered notifications from my office's monitoring service." Margaret explained that a title search had been conducted on my property, followed by the recording of a quitclaim deed transferring ownership from me to Richard, all within the past 2 weeks. Additionally, large withdrawals had been made from my investment accounts, authorized by the power of attorney I had unknowingly signed. "Have you authorized any of these transactions?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Absolutely not," I replied, the full magnitude of Richard's deception becoming horrifyingly clear. The documents I signed were represented as limited healthcare proxies and renovation authorizations. Margaret's response was immediate and decisive. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not confront Richard yet. I'm contacting the Elder Services Division and will have someone at your location within 2 hours. Say nothing to Richard if he returns before we arrive." The next 2 hours were among the longest of my life. I pretended normalcy when Richard called to say he'd be late, using the time to work with Sophia to gather what few personal documents I had access to in the rental house. When the doorbell rang, I expected Margaret or perhaps a social worker. Instead, I found Commissioner Vivian Martinez herself, head of the county's Elder Services Division and former prosecutor specializing in elder fraud, accompanied by 2 police officers and Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson," Commissioner Martinez began formally, "we have reason to believe you may be the victim of elder exploitation and financial fraud. We're here to ensure your safety and begin documentation of the situation." What followed was a carefully orchestrated intervention. The officers remained at the rental house with me while Commissioner Martinez and Margaret proceeded to my actual home on Magnolia Lane, where they discovered not construction work, but evidence of Richard preparing the property for sale. A real estate photographer had been scheduled for the following day, and a preliminary listing agreement was found among Richard's papers in the study. Most shocking was what they didn't find: any evidence of structural damage, termite activity, or ongoing renovations. The photographs Richard had shown me had been downloaded from construction websites, with property details skillfully edited to resemble my home. When Richard returned to the rental house later that evening, he was met by the officers, who detained him for questioning. His shocked expression upon seeing Commissioner Martinez and Margaret with me revealed the complete collapse of his calculated scheme. The following morning, with police escort, I returned to my home for the first time since my hospitalization, nearly 6 weeks earlier. There, on the front porch, I discovered the final piece of Richard's plan. All of my clothing and personal items he had claimed were in storage, stuffed unceremoniously into black garbage bags. He had been preparing to dispose of my possessions, erasing evidence of my presence from the home he now claimed to own. Standing on my porch, surrounded by the discarded remnants of my life in garbage bags, I experienced not just the pain of family betrayal, but the sudden clarity of someone whose professional expertise was now desperately needed for personal survival. The real estate attorney who had spent decades protecting others' property rights was now fighting for her own home, dignity, and future. As Commissioner Martinez documented the scene, I made a silent promise to myself and to every vulnerable senior who might face similar exploitation. This betrayal would not be the end of my story, but the beginning of a new chapter dedicated to ensuring that predators like Richard, whether family members or strangers, would find our community a hostile environment for their schemes. What Richard hadn't anticipated was that his actions would not only fail to secure my property, but would ultimately strengthen protections for countless seniors through the legal precedents and awareness his case would establish. The garbage bags on my porch weren't just a symbol of betrayal. They were evidence in what would become a landmark elder justice case that would change how our entire state approached the protection of senior property rights. Standing on my porch that morning, surrounded by garbage bags containing the carefully curated possessions of my lifetime, I experienced a clarity of purpose that transcended my physical pain and emotional betrayal. As a real estate attorney with over 30 years of experience, I had guided countless elderly clients through property disputes and exploitation attempts. Now, those professional skills would serve my own survival and recovery. We need to document everything exactly as we found it, I instructed Commissioner Martinez, my attorney's instincts overriding my personal distress. Photograph the bags, their placement, and make an inventory of contents as we bring them inside. This isn't just a betrayal. It's evidence. Martinez nodded approvingly, directing one of the officers to begin photographing while her assistant logged each item. Your professional background is showing, Eleanor. Most people in your situation would be too overwhelmed to think about evidence preservation. Most people haven't spent 3 decades watching predators manipulate property rights, I replied, using my walker to maneuver carefully up the ramp Richard had installed. Not for my benefit, I now realized, but to make the property more marketable as accessible. Entering my home for the first time in nearly 6 weeks felt surreal. The physical space remained unchanged, my furniture arranged as I'd left it, family photographs still displayed on mantels and walls. Yet subtle differences revealed Richard's preparations. Real estate staging books on the coffee table, paint swatches taped to several walls, and a notepad listing updates needed before listing in Richard's handwriting. Margaret Chen arrived with her paralegal 20 minutes later, bringing a portable scanner and laptop. We need to move quickly on several fronts, she explained, setting up a makeshift workstation at my dining room table. I've already filed emergency petitions to invalidate the quitclaim deed and power of attorney, but we need comprehensive documentation of how these documents were obtained through misrepresentation. Working methodically despite my physical discomfort, I began reconstructing the timeline of Richard's manipulation, from his initial increased interest in my life through the strategic isolation during my rehabilitation. Margaret's paralegal scanned every document I had signed during my hospitalization and rehabilitation, while Commissioner Martinez conducted a recorded interview documenting the misrepresentations Richard had made regarding each document's purpose and content. The power of attorney you supposedly signed has concerning irregularities, Margaret noted, examining the document closely. The notarization appears authentic, but the execution date coincides with your second day post-surgery, when medical records indicate you were on significant pain medication. I have no recollection of signing this specific document, I confirmed, reviewing the comprehensive property management powers it granted Richard. He presented multiple documents described as necessary for coordinating my medical care and home renovations. I would never have knowingly granted anyone this level of control over my property and finances. Commissioner Martinez interjected, "The notary's stamp belongs to Janice Wilson from Lakeside Recovery Center. We'll need to interview her about the circumstances of this notarization." My physical therapist arrived for my scheduled session as we worked, providing unexpected reinforcement to our documentation efforts. "I've been concerned about your situation for weeks," Denise confided after completing my exercises. "The rental house Richard arranged was completely inappropriate for your recovery needs. Minimal space for exercises, poorly maintained, and in an isolated location that limited your community support." She hesitated before adding, "I actually reported my concerns to Lakeside's social work department, but Richard intercepted the communication. The following week, my scheduled sessions with you were reduced from 3 weekly to 2, with Richard citing insurance limitations I knew to be false. This information added another dimension to our understanding of Richard's systematic effort to isolate me from potential advocates or resources. Denise agreed to provide a formal statement documenting her observations and the interference with her professional recommendations. By late afternoon, the physical and emotional demands of the day had left me exhausted. Commissioner Martinez arranged for a social services caseworker to remain at my home overnight, both to ensure my safety should Richard attempt to return and to assist with my physical needs, while recovery arrangements were reconfigured. Will Lau. Continue documentation tomorrow, Martinez assured me, gathering the materials we had organized. For now, focus on settling back into your home and getting needed rest. Officer Hayes will remain on the property overnight, and I've arranged for meals to be delivered. That evening, alone in my bedroom for the first time in weeks, I experienced conflicting emotions that would become familiar terrain in the months ahead: profound relief at being home, simmering anger at Richard's calculated betrayal, and steely determination to not only recover my own security, but to ensure his actions led to meaningful changes protecting other vulnerable seniors. The bedside phone rang just as I was settling in for the night. Patricia's voice carried both concern and confusion. "Mom, what's happening?" "Richard called claiming you're having serious confusion episodes and that the police are involved because you left the rental house against medical advice." This revelation, that Richard was attempting to undermine my credibility with Patricia, crystallized the comprehensive nature of his scheme. By portraying me as cognitively impaired, he could potentially challenge any legal actions I initiated to recover my property. "Patricia, I need you to listen carefully," I replied, keeping my voice measured and factual. "Richard has been systematically manipulating my situation since my hospitalization. He falsified documents to gain control of my property and finances, and was preparing to sell my house without my knowledge or consent." The silence that followed spoke volumes about the horrifying realization dawning on my daughter. When she finally spoke, her voice had transformed from confused concern to focused fury. "I'll be on the first flight tomorrow morning. What do you need me to bring?" "Just yourself," I answered, feeling unexpected tears of relief. "And perhaps your husband's expertise." Patricia's husband, Robert, was a forensic accountant whose skills would prove invaluable in tracing the financial aspects of Richard's scheme. True to her word, Patricia arrived the following morning, having taken an overnight flight that landed at 6:30 a.m. Her physical presence, practical, organized, and fiercely protective, provided emotional reinforcement that strengthened my resolve for the challenging days ahead. Margaret arrived an hour later with news that the emergency petition had been granted, a temporary injunction preventing any property transfers or additional financial transactions under the disputed power of attorney. "Judge Harriman has scheduled an emergency hearing for Friday morning," she explained. "That gives us 3 days to prepare our evidence demonstrating how these documents were obtained through deliberate misrepresentation." Commissioner Martinez joined us shortly thereafter, bringing a forensic document examiner and the preliminary police report on Richard's activities. "He was released on bail this morning," she informed us. "The conditions include no contact with Eleanor and a prohibition against entering her property. We've also placed a fraud alert on all your financial accounts and credit reports." What followed was 3 days of intense preparation that reminded me of the most complex property litigation cases of my career. Only now, I was both attorney and client, with my home and financial security hanging in the balance. Working methodically despite ongoing pain and fatigue from my recovery, I helped construct a detailed chronology documenting Richard's actions from the first increased visits through the discovery of my possessions in garbage bags. Patricia and Robert combed through financial records, discovering that Richard had not only begun the process of transferring my house, but had also liquidated one of my investment accounts. Nearly $145,000 transferred to a newly established account under his control. The transaction documentation included a forged authorization letter with a signature that, while similar to mine, contained subtle inconsistencies a professional examiner immediately identified as fraudulent. He created a sophisticated paper trail to make everything appear legitimate, Robert explained, organizing the financial documentation chronologically. If you hadn't discovered this when you did, he would have systematically depleted your assets while you remained isolated in that rental property. The healthcare providers from Lakeside Recovery Center provided additional evidence of manipulation. The social worker who had coordinated my discharge confirmed that Richard had presented himself as having medical power of attorney from the beginning of my hospitalization, though no such document existed at that time. The notary whose stamp appeared on the property power of attorney provided a sworn statement that she had notarized what Richard described as routine medical authorizations without witnessing my actual signature, a serious violation of notary requirements that would later result in the suspension of her license. Most disturbing were the contractor documents we discovered in Richard's abandoned briefcase at the rental house. Rather than evidence of structural damage to my home, we found staged photographs created using image editing software, along with fabricated estimates for repairs that would never occur. A call to the contracting company listed on the letterhead confirmed they had never inspected my property nor provided any estimates for work. This level of premeditation demonstrates clear intent, Margaret noted as we organized these materials for the hearing. He created an elaborate fiction about structural damage specifically to manipulate you into leaving your home during a vulnerable period. Friday morning arrived with unexpected clarity, as though the physical pain and emotional trauma had crystallized into focused determination that would carry me through the difficult public confrontation ahead. I dressed carefully in a tailored navy suit I had worn countless times to court during my professional career, a deliberate choice that reinforced my identity as an attorney rather than merely a vulnerable elderly woman. The courtroom was more crowded than I expected for an emergency hearing. In addition to our legal team and Richard with his attorney, Commissioner Martinez had arranged for several advocates from senior rights organizations to attend, recognizing the potential precedent-setting nature of the case. I also noticed several former colleagues from my legal career, a quiet show of professional support that fortified my resolve. Richard sat at the respondents' table, his expression alternating between confident dismissal and calculated concern when looking in my direction. His attorney, James Blackwell, was known throughout the legal community for defending clients accused of financial crimes, a telling choice that suggested Richard fully understood the potential criminal implications of his actions. Judge Harriman called the hearing to order promptly at 9 a.m., addressing preliminary matters with the efficient precision for which she was known. After confirming that all parties were properly represented, she invited Margaret to present our emergency petition. Your Honor, this petition seeks immediate invalidation of fraudulently obtained property transfer documents and financial authorizations, Margaret began, her calm professional tone belying the troubling nature of the evidence she would present. The respondent systematically exploited his aunt's temporary vulnerability following major surgery to obtain signatures on documents whose actual purpose and content were deliberately misrepresented. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret methodically presented the evidence we had assembled. The timeline of manipulation, medical records showing my mental state during the critical document signings, expert testimony from the document examiner, confirming forgery of financial authorizations, and the fabricated construction documents created to justify my removal from my home. Richard's attorney attempted to frame the situation as a family misunderstanding rather than deliberate exploitation. My client was genuinely concerned about his aunt's welfare following a serious medical event, Blackwell argued. Any miscommunications regarding document purposes were unintentional consequences of a stressful situation, not deliberate misrepresentation. This characterization might have seemed plausible had we not discovered the fabricated construction documents and evidence of financial transfers. When presented with these materials, Blackwell pivoted to suggesting that Richard had been acting within the authority he believed the power of attorney granted him, a weak defense that failed to address how that document had been obtained in the first place. The pivotal moment came when I took the stand to testify about the circumstances under which I had signed the various documents. Despite Richard's attorney's attempts to portray me as confused during my recovery, my testimony was precise, detailed, and unflappable, drawing on decades of courtroom experience that Blackwell had clearly not anticipated. "Mrs. Thompson," he began during cross-examination, "isn't it possible that in your medicated state following surgery, you simply don't remember the full explanations my client provided about these documents?" "Counselor, I practiced real estate law for 32 years before retirement," I replied evenly. "I would never knowingly sign a property transfer document or comprehensive power of attorney regardless of my physical condition. The only reason these signatures exist is because each document was specifically misrepresented as serving a different, limited purpose related to my medical care and home repairs." When Blackwell attempted to suggest that Richard's actions were motivated by genuine concern for my welfare, I responded with the evidence that most clearly revealed his actual intentions. If my nephew's concern was genuine, why did he place my personal possessions in garbage bags on the porch while preparing to sell my home? Why did he fabricate structural damage that never existed? Why did he isolate me from my attorney and other support resources? Most importantly, why did he transfer $145,000 of my retirement savings to an account under his sole control? Judge Harriman's intervention was immediate and pointed. "Mr. Blackwell, I've heard nothing that explains these actions as misunderstandings or well-intentioned family assistance. Does your client wish to provide testimony addressing these specific allegations?" Richard conferred briefly with his attorney before Blackwell responded. "Your Honor, given the potential criminal implications of these matters, my client will be exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination at this time. This decision, while legally prudent from a criminal defense perspective, effectively conceded the civil emergency petition." Judge Harriman wasted no time delivering her ruling. "Based on the comprehensive evidence presented, I find clear and convincing demonstration of fraud, misrepresentation, and exploitation in the obtainment of these legal instruments. The power of attorney dated March 12th and quitclaim deed recorded on April 3rd are hereby invalidated, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am issuing an order freezing all assets transferred under these invalidated instruments pending full accounting and restoration." She continued with specific provisions protecting my interests moving forward. The court further orders that all original documents be surrendered to the court within 24 hours, that respondent maintain no contact conditions already established by the criminal court, and that petitioner's property title be cleared of any clouds created by these fraudulent transactions. This ruling, while representing significant victory in securing my immediate safety and property rights, was just the beginning of what would become a multifaceted legal process involving both civil and criminal proceedings. As we gathered our materials following the hearing, Commissioner Martinez approached with both congratulations and pragmatic next steps. "This emergency order restores your legal control, but we have more work ahead," she explained. "The district attorney will want to meet regarding criminal charges, and we need to address the financial recovery aspects separately from the property issues." Patricia, who had remained supportive but quiet throughout the hearing, finally expressed the emotional impact that had been building. "I can't believe this happened, that Richard would deliberately target you this way. I encouraged your relationship with him, thinking family connection would be positive as you aged. I feel responsible for not recognizing the warning signs." "You couldn't have known," I assured her, though privately I wondered if her distance had contributed to my vulnerability, a complex emotional terrain we would need to navigate in rebuilding our relationship. What matters now is securing the practical protections to ensure this can't happen again, to me or to others. The following weeks brought intensified focus on both recovery fronts, my physical rehabilitation from hip surgery and the legal recovery of my financial security. The district attorney filed multiple criminal charges against Richard, including elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, and theft. These proceedings would follow a separate, longer timeline than our civil actions, with significant implications for Richard's future, beyond the immediate restoration of my property rights. On the financial front, Robert's forensic accounting expertise proved invaluable. He traced the transferred funds through multiple accounts, recovering the majority of the liquidated investment account. We discovered, however, that approximately $28,000 had already been spent, some on legitimate expenses related to my care, but much on Richard's personal expenses and preparations for property sale, including payments to a real estate photographer and stager. Throughout this period, I continued working with Commissioner Martinez to transform my personal experience into educational tools for preventing similar exploitation. My professional background in property law combined with first-hand experience as an exploitation victim created uniquely powerful perspective for training financial institutions, healthcare providers, and legal professionals in recognizing warning signs of predatory behavior targeting seniors. Your case demonstrates how even individuals with significant legal knowledge can be vulnerable during health crises, Martinez observed during one planning session for an educational program. If someone with your background can be manipulated through these methods, imagine how vulnerable seniors without legal expertise must be. This recognition that my exploitation resulted from temporary vulnerability rather than permanent incapacity became central to the prevention framework we developed. Traditional protective approaches often focused on identifying cognitive impairment as the primary risk factor for exploitation. My experience highlighted how physical health crises created temporary vulnerabilities that predators could exploit even when cognitive function remained intact. 6 weeks after the emergency hearing, with my physical recovery progressing steadily and the immediate legal protections in place, I faced an unexpected emotional challenge. The criminal prosecutor contacted me regarding potential plea negotiations in Richard's case. He's offering full financial restitution and acceptance of a permanent protective order in exchange for reduced charges, the prosecutor explained during our meeting. This would guarantee recovery of your financial losses without the stress of criminal trial testimony, but it would likely result in probation rather than incarceration. This proposal forced difficult reflection on what justice meant in this situation. As an attorney, I understood the practical benefits of guaranteed financial resolution and avoiding the uncertainties of trial. As a victim, I struggled with whether this outcome would provide sufficient accountability for actions that had gone far beyond financial harm to include profound violations of trust and dignity. What precedent would this set for other elder exploitation cases? I asked, considering the broader implications beyond my individual situation. That's precisely why I wanted your input before responding, the prosecutor acknowledged. Your case has attracted significant attention within the elder justice community. The outcome will inevitably influence how similar cases are approached. After consulting with Patricia, Margaret, and Commissioner Martinez, I ultimately endorsed a modified plea agreement that included mandatory restitution, significant community service specifically with elder service organizations, and, most importantly, permanent surrender of any fiduciary licenses Richard held in financial or real estate fields. This approach balanced practical recovery considerations with ensuring his actions carried consequences protecting other potential victims. Your decision reflects the same principles that guided your legal career, Margaret observed when I explained my reasoning. Practical problem solving while considering broader community protection beyond individual remedy. As summer transitioned to fall, my physical recovery reached important milestones. I progressed from walker to cane, regaining independence in daily activities and gradually resuming community engagements. The garden that had witnessed my initial injury became therapeutic space for gentle rehabilitation exercises, its familiar pathways and plants providing both physical challenge and emotional healing. The civil proceedings concluded with court-ordered restoration of all financial assets, compensation for legal expenses, and complete clearing of any claims against my property title. Richard's professional licenses in real estate and financial planning were permanently revoked following separate disciplinary proceedings, creating concrete protection against his engaging in similar schemes targeting others. Perhaps most significant, for long-term impact, Commissioner Martinez incorporated findings from my case into proposed legislative reforms, strengthening protections against elder exploitation. The Thompson provisions, as they became informally known among advocates, included enhanced verification requirements for property transfers involving seniors, expanded notification requirements when legal instruments were modified following medical events, and stricter liability for notaries who failed to follow proper witnessing protocols for vulnerable adults. Your willingness to make your experience public has already changed how our financial institutions approach these issues, Martinez explained during a meeting with state legislators considering the proposed reforms. 3 major banks have implemented new verification protocols for property transfers involving seniors, directly resulting from training programs using your case study. This transformation of personal trauma into systemic change brought unexpected meaning to an experience that might otherwise have remained simply a painful chapter in my later years. The professional expertise I had developed throughout my career found new application in elder advocacy work that would protect countless others from similar exploitation attempts. 8 months after finding my possessions in garbage bags, I hosted a gathering at my home for the expanding network of professionals and advocates who had become part of my recovery journey. The autumn garden provided perfect setting for celebrating both personal healing and professional purpose that had emerged from difficult circumstances. Judge Harriman, who had issued the emergency orders protecting my property, engaged me in conversation about the broader implications of my case. Your situation has become something of a watershed in how we approach these cases, she noted. The combination of your legal background and willingness to speak publicly created particularly compelling educational platform. I never expected to become the case study I'd cite in training programs, I acknowledged with rueful smile. But if my experience helps others recognize these patterns before exploitation succeeds, perhaps there's purpose in what happened. As evening approached and guests departed, Patricia lingered to help restore the garden to order. Our relationship had deepened through this ordeal, her initial guilt about not recognizing Richard's manipulations gradually yielding to strengthened commitment to remaining connected despite geographical separation. I've been offered a position with the hospital network here, she revealed as we gathered cushions from garden furniture. It would mean relocating back to this area with Robert and the boys. We've been discussing the possibility since everything happened. This unexpected development, her considering professional change specifically to be nearer, reflected how profoundly Richard's exploitation attempt had affected our family dynamics. The crisis that might have estranged less resilient relationships had instead catalyzed recognition of priorities, easily obscured by daily obligations and geographical distance. The boys would benefit from being closer to you, she continued, careful to frame the potential change as mutual advantage rather than protective surveillance. And professionally, the position actually represents advancement rather than lateral move. I'd welcome having you closer, I responded truthfully, though not if it requires professional compromise. We've established better communication systems regardless of geography. Indeed, the regular video calls, shared digital calendar, and emergency protocols we had implemented following Richard's exploitation attempt had already transformed our long-distance relationship. Geography mattered less than transparent communication and mutual respect for both independence and interdependence, a balance we were gradually establishing through intentional effort. That evening, sitting on my restored porch swing as twilight settled over the neighborhood I had nearly lost, I reflected on the journey from victimization to advocacy. The garbage bags that had contained my discarded possessions had become powerful symbol in educational presentations, visual representation of how exploitation attempts literally and figuratively attempt to discard the identity and dignity of targeted seniors. The community connections I had cultivated throughout decades in the neighborhood had proven crucial protective factors once Richard's scheme was discovered. Neighbors who had witnessed unusual activities at my home during my absence provided key testimony regarding when and how my possessions had been removed. The local pharmacist who questioned unusual medication changes Richard attempted to implement contributed important evidence of his systematic efforts to compromise my independence. Most significantly, the professional knowledge I had developed throughout my legal career had transformed from abstract expertise into vital personal resource during crisis. The attorney who had guided countless clients through property disputes had ultimately needed those same skills to protect her own home and dignity when exploitation arrived not from stranger, but from family member claiming protective concern, while implementing calculated theft. As darkness settled over my garden, I found unexpected peace in this new chapter of life, one that included both heightened awareness of vulnerability and strengthened commitment to transforming that awareness into protection for others. The garbage bags meant to erase my presence had instead catalyzed renewed purpose that extended far beyond individual recovery to community-wide transformation in how elder exploitation was recognized, addressed, and ultimately prevented. What Richard hadn't anticipated when placing those bags on my porch was how tangible symbols of exploitation would become powerful educational tools in the hands of someone with both professional knowledge and personal experience of the patterns he had employed. The attorney whose career had been built on protecting property rights had found new voice as advocate whose lived experience transformed abstract legal principles into compelling narrative that was already changing systems, policies, and practices throughout our state and beyond. 1 year after finding my possessions in garbage bags, I stood at a podium in the state capitol building, addressing legislators considering the Elder Financial Protection Act that had emerged from my case. The marble chamber, with its solemn architecture and historical gravitas, provided fitting backdrop for legislation that would protect vulnerable seniors for generations to come. When exploitation happens, it's not just about financial assets, I explained to the assembled committee members. It's about dignity, independence, and the fundamental right to security in one's later years. The garbage bags containing my clothing and personal mementos represented more than property theft. They symbolized an attempt to erase my identity and existence. Commissioner Martinez sat beside me, ready to address the technical aspects of the proposed legislation. The journey from personal trauma to potential state law had been neither simple nor linear, involving countless meetings with advocacy groups, legal experts, and legislators to transform individual experience into comprehensive protective framework. They are Thompson provisions. Before you today address 3 critical vulnerabilities in our current system, I continued, referencing the sections of the bill named after my case. First, enhanced verification requirements for property transfers involving seniors. Second, mandatory cooling-off periods for legal instruments executed during medical events. Third, expanded accountability for professionals who fail to follow proper protocols when seniors execute significant legal documents. As I concluded my testimony, Senator Lillian Cortez, the bill's primary sponsor, posed the question that had become central to our advocacy work. Mrs. Thompson, given your legal background, why were existing protections insufficient to prevent what happened to you? This question cut to the heart of why legislation was necessary, rather than simply better enforcement of existing laws. My response drew directly from both professional knowledge and personal experience. Current protections primarily address 2 scenarios: outright theft through deception and exploitation of cognitively impaired seniors. My situation revealed the substantial gap between these categories: temporary vulnerability during health crises when cognitive function remains intact but physical dependency creates perfect conditions for manipulation through misrepresentation. I explained how Richard had exploited not legal loopholes but implementation gaps. Notaries who didn't properly witness signatures, healthcare providers who accepted his representation as my authorized agent without proper verification, financial institutions that process transfers with minimal questioning when documents appeared superficially legitimate. These weren't failures of law, but failures of practice, professionals following minimal compliance requirements without meaningful verification. The proposed legislation creates affirmative obligations that would have prevented my exploitation. At multiple points, the committee voted unanimously that afternoon to advance the bill to the full legislature, a significant milestone in our advocacy journey. As we gathered our materials following the hearing, Commissioner Martinez reflected on the transformation our work had undergone. "When we first met on your porch a year ago, I never anticipated we'd be here today," she observed. Most exploitation victims understandably focus on their individual recovery rather than systemic change. Most exploitation victims don't have 30 years of legal experience and stubborn determination, I replied with a smile that acknowledged both the challenges and unexpected purpose that had emerged from difficult circumstances. The truth was, that advocacy work had provided healing pathway that private recovery alone might not have offered. Transforming painful experience into protective systems for others had created meaning from circumstances that might otherwise have remained simply traumatic episode best forgotten. The unexpected champion for our legislative efforts had emerged in my daughter Patricia, who had indeed relocated with her family 6 months earlier. Her hospital administration background provided valuable healthcare perspective on how exploitation often began during medical events, insights that strengthened the bill's provisions regarding medical settings. The hospital network is implementing new verification protocols based on your case, Patricia explained during our weekly family dinner that evening. All powers of attorney presented during admissions now undergo enhanced verification process, including direct confirmation with the purported grantor when possible. This practical application of lessons from my experience within major healthcare system represented exactly the type of systemic change we hoped to achieve through both legislation and professional education. Individual protection required not just legal remedies after exploitation occurred, but preventative systems that identified warning signs before losses happened. My grandsons, initially reluctant about relocating mid-school year, had gradually embraced their new community and the closer relationship with me that proximity allowed. 16-year-old Michael had recently begun accompanying me to speaking engagements at senior centers, developing unexpected passion for elder justice issues that incorporated seamlessly into his interest in constitutional rights. "Grandma, you're becoming famous in my civics class," he commented, showing me a classroom assignment analyzing pending legislation that included the Elder Financial Protection Act as one of the case studies. "Mr. Jefferson uses your story when explaining how individual citizens can influence lawmaking. This educational ripple effect, my experience becoming teaching tool in high school civics classes, represented unanticipated extension of our advocacy impact. Young people learning about elder exploitation created intergenerational awareness that would serve protective function as they entered professional fields and supported aging family members. The legislative hearing marked important milestone, but not conclusion of our advocacy journey. Implementation of new protections, once passed, would require extensive professional education across multiple sectors: legal, financial, healthcare, and social services. This next phase had already begun through the training programs developed collaboratively between Commissioner Martinez's office and the continuing legal education division at State University's Law School. We've scheduled the 5th financial institutions training for next month, Martinez informed me as we left the Capitol. The wait list keeps growing. Bankers are recognizing these verification protocols protect both vulnerable clients and their institutions from liability. Training programs had evolved significantly since the first session 9 months earlier. What began as my personal testimony accompanied by basic warning signs had developed into comprehensive professional education, incorporating case studies, role-playing scenarios, and specific verification protocols tailored to different institutional contexts. Most gratifying was how financial professionals increasingly recognized these protections as practical risk management rather than burdensome regulation, measures that served both institutional interests and client welfare simultaneously. 3 major banks and 2 credit unions had already implemented verification systems exceeding the proposed legislative requirements, creating competitive advantage through elder-friendly institutional practices. 2 weeks after the legislative hearing, I received unexpected invitation from Judge Harriman, who had issued the emergency orders protecting my property during the initial crisis. Now serving as chief judicial educator for the state court system, she requested my participation in developing training materials for probate and family court judges handling elder exploitation cases. Your situation highlighted critical gaps in how courts evaluate these cases, she explained during our planning meeting. Many judges view these matters primarily as family disputes rather than exploitation cases with potential criminal dimensions. Your experience bridges that conceptual gap effectively. This judicial education component represented particularly meaningful extension of our advocacy work. Judges exercised tremendous discretionary authority in exploitation cases, their individual understanding of exploitation dynamics often determining whether victims received meaningful protection or were returned to vulnerable circumstances with minimal intervention. Working with Judge Harriman's team, I helped develop judicial training modules addressing common misconceptions about elder exploitation, particularly the assumption that family members acting as caretakers necessarily had the elder's best interests as primary motivation. My case study provided compelling evidence of how caretaking roles could be strategically assumed, specifically to facilitate exploitation during vulnerability periods. The concerned relative presentation is among the most challenging aspects for courts to evaluate, Judge Harriman acknowledged during one development session. Richard's performance as the devoted nephew temporarily fooled everyone. Healthcare providers, social workers, even initially your daughter. Judges need specific red flags to watch for behind that presentation. Together, we identified key indicators that might have revealed Richard's actual motives earlier. His sudden increased interest coinciding with financial difficulties, the strategic isolation from professional advisors during vulnerability periods, discouraging second opinions or independent verification, and resisting documentation of verbal agreements. These warning signs became central components of the judicial training materials, providing practical evaluation framework for distinguishing genuine concern from predatory opportunism. As these professional education efforts expanded, Richard's case proceeded through the criminal justice system. The modified plea agreement I had endorsed resulted in felony conviction with suspended sentence, significant community service requirements, permanent professional licensure revocation, and full financial restitution. While some advocates had hoped for incarceration, I remained convinced that the professional consequences and permanent criminal record created more meaningful accountability than brief imprisonment would have provided. Less publicly visible but equally significant was the personal recovery work that continued alongside these advocacy efforts. The emotional trauma of family betrayal didn't disappear simply because legal remedies had been secured. Working with Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a therapist specializing in late-life transitions and trauma, I gradually processed the complex grief associated with familial exploitation, mourning not just the material losses that had been restored, but the shattering of fundamental trust that would never be fully recovered. Financial exploitation by family members creates particularly complex emotional aftermath, Dr. Simmons observed during one session. The practical remedies may be secured through legal channels, but the relationship injuries require different healing process. This insight, distinguishing between practical recovery and emotional healing, proved particularly valuable as I navigated evolving family dynamics. Patricia's relocation had restored daily connection, but also created new boundary challenges as she occasionally demonstrated hypervigilance about my independence that reminded me uncomfortably of Richard's initial approaches, though with genuinely protective rather than exploitative intent. I know you're trying to help, I explained gently when she questioned my decision to resume volunteer tax preparation services at the senior center. But my continued engagement in meaningful activities isn't something to be protected from. It's something to be protected for. Independence isn't just about physical safety, it's about ongoing purpose and contribution. These conversations, sometimes difficult but always honest, gradually established healthier balance between appropriate support and respect for autonomy. Patricia's professional background in healthcare administration sometimes pulled her toward risk management perspective, while my legal training emphasized self-determination rights. Finding middle ground required ongoing dialogue rather than single resolution, a process that ultimately strengthened our relationship through mutual respect. 18 months after the garbage bags incident, the Elder Financial Protection Act passed the state legislature with overwhelming bipartisan support, a rare achievement in our politically divided era. Governor Eleanor Ramirez invited me to participate in the signing ceremony, acknowledging the central role my experience had played in catalyzing this comprehensive legislation. Laws often bear the names of victims whose suffering revealed regulatory gaps, the governor noted during her remarks. The Thompson provisions instead bear the name of a survivor whose expertise and advocacy transformed personal trauma into protection for countless others. This framing, emphasizing survivorship and expertise rather than victimization, reflected precisely the message our advocacy efforts had consistently advanced. Vulnerability during health crises could happen to anyone, regardless of professional background or cognitive capacity. Protection required systemic safeguards rather than simply addressing individual exploitation after it occurred. The legislation's provisions would be implemented gradually over the following year, with different requirements phased in to allow institutions and professionals time to develop compliance systems. Commissioner Martinez's office had already begun developing implementation guidelines and training resources, ensuring the law's provisions would translate into meaningful practical protections rather than remaining theoretical safeguards. As public interest in our advocacy work expanded, I received increasing invitations to share my experience through media appearances, conference presentations, and documentary interviews. While initially hesitant about this public role, I gradually recognized how personalizing elder justice issues through my story created emotional connection to what might otherwise remain abstract policy matters. People remember stories far more effectively than statistics, observed Sandra Chen, the public television producer developing documentary series on elder justice issues. Your willingness to share painful personal experience creates accessibility point for information that might otherwise seem irrelevant to those not currently facing these situations. This insight influenced how I structured my presentations, balancing personal narrative with actionable information. Rather than simply recounting exploitation events, I focused on specific warning signs, intervention points, and preventative measures that audience members could implement for themselves or vulnerable family members. The garbage bags became powerful visual metaphor representing how exploitation attempts to discard the humanity and dignity of targeted individuals. Concrete image that resonated more effectively than abstract discussions of financial mechanisms. 2. Years after the initial exploitation attempt, I participated in national conference bringing together elder justice advocates, financial industry representatives, healthcare providers, and lawmakers from across the country. Our state's comprehensive legislation had attracted attention from other jurisdictions seeking to strengthen their protective systems, creating opportunity to expand our impact beyond geographical boundaries. Your model legislation addresses the critical gap between incapacity-based protections and fraud protections, noted Congressman James Williams, who was developing federal legislation addressing elder financial exploitation. What's particularly effective is how it creates verification obligations without imposing barriers to legitimate transactions. This balance, enhancing protections without creating unnecessary obstacles, had been central principle throughout our legislative development process. Working with financial institutions, We had designed verification requirements that could be integrated into existing customer interaction protocols, rather than creating burdensome separate processes that might be inconsistently implemented. The conference also provided opportunity to connect with other exploitation survivors who had similarly transformed their experiences into advocacy work. Sophia Martinez from Arizona had established notification system for property transactions involving seniors after her mother lost her home through fraudulent transfer. Thomas Chen from Oregon had developed financial institution training program after his father's retirement accounts were drained by caregiver exploitation. Together, we represented growing movement of survivor advocates whose personal experiences provided uniquely effective educational platform. There's something particularly compelling about professionals who have experienced exploitation themselves, observed Dr. Rachel Goldman, leading researcher in elder justice field. It disrupts the common assumption that exploitation only happens to those who are cognitively impaired or financially unsophisticated. This disruption of stereotypical narratives about who experiences exploitation became increasingly central to my advocacy messaging. By acknowledging my own vulnerability despite decades of legal expertise, I created permission for others to recognize and address potential exploitation situations without shame or embarrassment, critical step in encouraging earlier intervention when warning signs appeared. The documentary project with Sandra Chen developed into 6-part series examining different aspects of elder justice, with my story featured prominently in the episode addressing property exploitation. Filming at my home provided opportunity to visually represent both what had been at stake and the recovery that followed, my restored garden symbolizing resilience and renewal after trauma. The physical environment becomes character in exploitation. Narratives, Sandra observed as the crew captured footage of me tending roses I had cultivated for decades. Your home represents not just financial asset, but personal history and identity, dimensions that make exploitation particularly traumatic, beyond material losses. This insight, that exploitation attacks identity and dignity alongside financial security, had emerged consistently throughout our advocacy work. The most effective protective measures addressed not just financial mechanics, but the psychological and emotional dynamics that facilitated exploitation. Richard had targeted not just my property, but my independence and self-determination, attempting to replace my decision-making with his control, justified through language of protection and assistance. As filming concluded, Sandra asked question that had gradually become central to my understanding of both personal experience and broader advocacy mission. What do you most want people to understand about elder exploitation that isn't typically addressed in policy? Discussions? My response emerged from nearly 3 years of reflection on both individual trauma and systemic vulnerabilities. That protection without autonomy isn't protection at all. It's simply different form of control. True protection enhances self-determination rather than diminishing it, providing support that expands rather than contracts individual freedom. The most dangerous exploiters are those who disguise control as protection, using safety concerns, to justify gradually replacing the elder's choices with their own decisions. This fundamental principle, distinguishing between supportive protection and controlling intervention, had become foundation for both legislative provisions and professional training materials developed through our advocacy work. The verification requirements, cooling-off periods, and enhanced accountability standards all served underlying purpose of ensuring elders' expressed preferences remained central rather than being overridden by others' judgments about appropriate decisions. 3 years after finding my possessions in garbage bags, I hosted gathering in my garden for the expanding network of professionals, advocates, and survivors who had become interconnected through our elder justice work. The autumn afternoon provided perfect setting for celebrating both individual healing and collective impact of efforts that had grown from personal crisis to multi-state initiative. Patricia circulated among guests, her professional confidence evident as she discussed the hospital network's implementation of protective protocols with healthcare representatives. My grandsons helped serve refreshments, Michael engaging legislators in surprisingly sophisticated discussion of pending amendments to strengthen enforcement provisions of the original act. Commissioner Martinez arrived with unexpected guest, Governor Ramirez, who had championed our legislation through challenging political negotiations. Their arrival caused momentary stir before conversations resumed with typical focus on practical implementation challenges and emerging protective strategies. "Your garden seems fitting metaphor for this work," the governor observed, as I showed her the heritage roses that had survived both my initial injury and the period of neglect during hospitalization. Beauty requiring both protection and freedom to thrive. Too much intervention stifles growth, while complete exposure leaves vulnerability to damage. This balance, between necessary protection and essential freedom, had indeed become central theme in both my personal recovery and professional advocacy. The most effective interventions enhanced security while preserving autonomy, providing supports that expanded rather than restricted individual choice within protective framework. As sunset approached and guests gradually departed, I found quiet, moment alone on the porch swing that had witnessed both my pre-injury independence and post-recovery renewal. The home that had nearly been taken through exploitation had become not just personal sanctuary, but symbolic space representing resilience and transformation, physical embodiment of journey from victimization to empowerment. Judge Harriman, among the last to leave, paused to share unexpected update about our judicial education programs. "The Thompson case study has been adopted by the National Judicial College for their elder justice curriculum," she reported with evident satisfaction. "Your experience will now inform judicial training nationwide, not just within our state." This expansion, from local incident to national educational resource, represented precisely the transformative impact we had hoped might emerge from painful personal experience. The garbage bags meant to discard my identity had instead catalyzed educational frameworks that would protect countless others from similar exploitation attempts. Later that evening, sitting in my study, surrounded by both legal resources that had informed my career and advocacy materials developed from my exploitation experience, I reflected on the journey's unexpected dimensions. The professional expertise I had developed throughout my career had proven essential in fighting exploitation, yet equally important had been the vulnerability experience that transformed abstract knowledge into lived understanding of exploitation dynamics. This integration of professional expertise and personal experience had created uniquely effective advocacy platform that neither element alone would have provided. My legal knowledge enabled recognition of exploitation mechanisms, while personal experience created emotional authenticity that connected audiences to sometimes technical material in ways pure professional presentation might not have achieved. Most meaningful had been witnessing how individual story catalyzed systemic changes extending far beyond personal circumstances. Verification protocols implemented by financial institutions, training programs adopted by healthcare systems, judicial education materials incorporated into national curriculum, and legislative frameworks being replicated in other states. What began as isolated exploitation attempt had generated concentric circles of protection, benefiting vulnerable seniors across expanding geographical reach. Patricia's light knock interrupted these reflections as she delivered folder of thank you messages from event attendees. Several guests mentioned writing training materials inspired by today's discussions, she noted, her administrative efficiency complementing my advocacy vision in ways that strengthened our collaborative efforts. Commissioner Martinez mentioned possible federal testimony opportunity next month, she added, referencing congressional hearings on national elder justice legislation. They're specifically interested in the enhanced verification model our financial institutions have implemented. This potential federal dimension represented next horizon for advocacy work that had already exceeded any expectations I might have formed when initially fighting to reclaim my property and dignity. The garbage bags had been transformed from symbols of victimization to compelling educational tools, illustrating exploitation's dehumanizing intent, visual representation that made abstract concepts immediately accessible to diverse audiences. Patricia departed with characteristic efficiency, promising to organize the event feedback into actionable implementation suggestions. I returned to the garden for final evening moments among plants that had witnessed both traumatic beginnings and transformative outcomes of this unexpected life chapter. The heritage roses, propagated from cuttings shared by neighbors decades earlier, had survived periods of neglect during my absence and flourished with renewed attention following my return. Their resilience provided fitting metaphor for recovery journey that had included both rehabilitation challenges and advocacy opportunities, process that restored not just property rights, but deeper sense of purpose and contribution. Standing among these living connections to both past and future, I reflected on an essential message emerging from 3 years of intensive healing and advocacy work: that true protection enhanced rather than diminished autonomy. That vulnerability created not just risk, but opportunity for deeper understanding. And that transformation of personal trauma into systemic change represented perhaps the most profound form of recovery available to those who experienced exploitation. The garbage bags intended to discard my identity had instead catalyzed, renewed, purpose that extended far beyond individual circumstances to create protective frameworks benefiting countless others. What began as devastating betrayal had ultimately strengthened rather than destroyed my sense of agency and contribution, transforming victim narrative into survivor advocate journey with impact exceeding anything I might have accomplished without. Experiencing exploitation's painful realities firsthand. As darkness settled over the garden that had witnessed both injury and healing, I found unexpected peace in journey that had incorporated both professional knowledge and personal vulnerability into uniquely effective advocacy platform. The attorney who had protected others' property rights throughout her career had ultimately needed to fight for her own home and dignity, emerging from that battle with expanded mission that integrated professional expertise and lived experience into compelling educational foundation for systemic change. The garbage bags on my porch hadn't represented ending but beginning of recovery journey that incorporated both personal healing and public advocacy into integrated path forward. What exploitation attempted to diminish, resilience had ultimately expanded, creating legacy of protection extending far beyond individual circumstances to benefit vulnerable others through systems, policies, and educational frameworks that would continue evolving long after my direct involvement eventually concluded. This unexpected transformation, from exploitation target to recognized advocacy leader, represented not just personal victory, but fundamental challenge to exploitation's dehumanizing intent. The very vulnerability experiences that exploiters targeted as weakness had ultimately created powerful platform for educational work that strengthened protective systems on multiple levels. What Richard had meant for harm had ultimately generated good exceeding any protection I might have created without experiencing exploitation's painful realities directly. In this transformation lay perhaps the most profound response to exploitation's destructive intent, not just recovering what was nearly taken, but creating from that experience protective legacy extending to countless others who would never know my name, but whose dignity and security would be preserved through systems catalyzed by garbage bags that failed to accomplish their intended erasure of my identity, independence, and fundamental human worth. 5 years after finding my possessions in garbage bags, I stood in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by advocates, lawmakers, and survivors gathered for the signing of the National Elder Justice Act. The comprehensive legislation incorporated key elements from our state's pioneering framework, expanding protections for vulnerable seniors across the country through enhanced verification requirements, cooling-off periods for significant transactions following medical events, and strengthened accountability for professionals serving seniors. President Harrison's remarks acknowledged the grassroots origins of these protections. This legislation emerged not from theoretical policy discussions, but from lived experiences of survivors who transformed personal trauma into public advocacy. Eleanor Thompson's journey from finding her possessions discarded in garbage bags to creating multi-layered protections represents the citizen-driven change that strengthens our democracy. This recognition, at the highest level of government, provided powerful validation of advocacy work that had expanded from local crisis to national movement. The garbage bags that had symbolized my nephew's attempt to erase my existence had, instead, catalyzed protective systems that would now extend to seniors across all 50 states. Commissioner Martinez, now serving as the newly appointed Federal Elder Justice Coordinator, stood beside me during the ceremony. Our 5-year collaboration, culminating in this national expansion of protections we had carefully developed through state-level implementation and refinement. "From your porch to the White House," she whispered as we watched the president sign the legislation, not the journey either of us anticipated when we met that day. Indeed, the path from personal crisis to national policy had contained unexpected dimensions that expanded far beyond our initial focus on legal remedies and property protection. What began as effort to restore my individual security had evolved into multifaceted movement, addressing fundamental questions about autonomy, dignity, and self-determination in later life. The most profound impacts often emerged in settings far removed from legislative chambers or courthouse proceedings. 2 weeks after the White House ceremony, I received email from a bank teller in Oregon who had completed the financial institutions training program developed from my case study. Yesterday, I recognized the warning signs we learned about when an elderly customer came in with his financial advisor to withdraw $45,000 for emergency home repairs. Following the Thompson Protocol, I implemented the 24-hour verification hold and separate questioning. The customer later called to thank us. The advisor was running a scam targeting seniors throughout our community. Your experience saved not just his savings, but potentially many others who would have been targeted. These individual prevention stories, increasingly frequent as training programs expanded nationwide, provided tangible evidence that systemic changes were creating real protection at the critical intervention points where exploitation could be interrupted before significant harm occurred. Educational implementation had advanced alongside legislative development, with the Thompson case study now incorporated into training curricula for financial professionals, healthcare providers, legal practitioners, and law enforcement across the country. The documentary series Sandra Chen produced had expanded into required viewing for professional licensing in several states, personalizing abstract policy concepts through compelling narrative that resonated across professional boundaries. Perhaps, most significantly, cultural attitudes regarding elder autonomy had begun shifting through sustained advocacy messaging that challenged traditional assumptions about aging and decision-making capacity. Research partnerships with 3 universities had documented measurable changes in professional attitudes following training programs that emphasized supporting autonomy rather than restricting independence in the name of protection. The paradigm shift from protection through control to protection through empowered choice represents fundamental reframing of how we approach elder security, noted Dr. Eliza Washington, leading researcher studying implementation outcomes across diverse communities. The Thompson framework has catalyzed essential conversation about distinguishing between supportive services that enhance autonomy and paternalistic interventions that diminish self-determination. This distinction between support that expanded choices versus intervention that restricted options had emerged consistently throughout our advocacy development. The verification requirements we designed deliberately avoided creating additional barriers for seniors while ensuring their expressed wishes weren't overridden through misrepresentation or manipulation. My 79th birthday arrived with quiet celebration among family and close friends in the garden that had witnessed both injury and healing over these eventful years. Patricia had organized small gathering featuring foods from significant moments throughout my life. my grandmother's bread recipe that I had taught her in the kitchen decades earlier, celebration cake from her law school graduation, and fresh herbs from the garden we now tended together during weekend visits. "We have unexpected news," she announced as dessert was served, exchanging meaningful glance with her husband Robert. "The university has approved creation of the Thompson Center for Elder Justice, with inaugural funding secured through the Justice Department's new prevention initiative. This development, creating permanent academic home for both research and training programs developed through our advocacy work, represented institutional commitment that would sustain these efforts beyond individual involvement. The center would house comprehensive training resources, research initiatives measuring implementation outcomes, and clinical programs providing direct services to exploitation survivors. They've asked if you would consider serving as founding director," Patricia continued, her expression suggesting she already anticipated my response. "With flexibility to determine your own involvement level and excellent support staff already identified, the offer represented both honor and challenge, opportunity to consolidate advocacy work within sustainable institutional framework while requiring energy commitment that warranted careful consideration at 79. Yet the alternative, watching these initiatives potentially lose momentum without champion ensuring consistent implementation of core principles, seemed unacceptable given how many vulnerable seniors would benefit from continued program development. I'll need to establish clear boundaries from the beginning," I replied after thoughtful consideration. "Perhaps consulting directorship with flexible schedule and excellent deputy handling daily operations." Patricia smiled with evident relief. "Already discussed. They're prepared to structure position honoring both your expertise and realistic energy limitations. Dr. Maria Gonzalez would serve as executive deputy, handling operational responsibilities while you focus on strategic direction and key relationships. This thoughtful framework, acknowledging both valuable contribution and practical limitations, reflected precisely the balanced approach to autonomy support we had advocated throughout our elder justice work. The position would provide continued platform for advancing core principles while incorporating realistic recognition of energetic capacity at my stage of life. My grandsons, now in college, expressed characteristic support for this new chapter. Michael, pursuing legal studies with focus on elder law, had completed internship with Commissioner Martinez's office before her federal appointment. His younger brother Thomas, studying healthcare administration, had developed particular interest in hospital protocols preventing exploitation during medical vulnerability periods. "The family business evolves," Robert observed with quiet pride, in how both young men had incorporated aspects of our advocacy work into their professional development. From unexpected crisis to multi-generational commitment to creating better systems. Indeed, what began as isolated exploitation attempt had catalyzed family purpose extending beyond my individual experience or lifetime. Patricia's professional focus had shifted significantly toward elder justice initiatives within healthcare administration, while Robert's forensic accounting expertise now included specialized concentration in financial exploitation investigation. The Thompson Center would provide institutional home for this family commitment, ensuring continuance beyond my direct involvement. 2 months after my birthday, the center's founding ceremony brought together diverse stakeholders from advocacy, journey that had evolved over 5 transformative years. Financial institutions that had implemented verification protocols shared outcomes, data demonstrating both prevention effectiveness and minimal disruption to legitimate transactions. Healthcare systems presented findings from enhanced discharge planning programs, incorporating exploitation risk assessment. Law enforcement representatives discussed improved investigation protocols resulting from specialized training programs. During the reception following formal program, I found quiet moment with Judge Harriman, whose initial emergency orders had preserved my property rights during critical early days of crisis response. "I'm retiring from the bench next month," she confided, surveying the gathering that represented culmination of work we had begun in her courtroom years earlier. They've asked me to serve on the center's Judicial Education Advisory Board. Thought, I should confirm you wouldn't find that awkward given our history. Quite the opposite, I assured her, genuinely pleased by potential collaboration. Your understanding of both legal complexities and practical implementation challenges would be tremendously valuable. Her participation would extend judicial education work that had already transformed how courts approached exploitation cases throughout the state system. The bench guide developed from my case had been adopted by judicial education programs in 37 states, providing practical framework for distinguishing between legitimate family assistance and predatory manipulation disguised as protection. As summer transitioned to fall, the center's operational structure took shape with carefully designed balance between academic research, practical training implementation, and direct services for exploitation survivors. My consulting directorship provided strategic guidance while allowing realistic accommodation of energy limitations and gradual transition toward sustainable leadership, independent of my direct involvement. This institutional development coincided with related milestone, Richard's completion of 5-year probation period following his conviction. The final restitution payment had been processed months earlier, closing financial aspects of case that had long since transformed from personal crisis to systemic reform catalyst. I received formal notification of his probation completion from the district attorney's office, along with confirmation that permanent professional licensure revocations remained in effect despite completed criminal sentence. The notification prompted reflection on complex journey from victim seeking justice to advocate creating systems change, evolution that had incorporated both personal healing and public purpose into integrated recovery pathway. Do you ever hear anything about his current circumstances? Patricia asked during one of our regular garden work sessions, broaching subject we rarely discuss directly. Occasionally through community networks, I acknowledged, deadheading roses that had become symbolic representation of resilience throughout this journey. He completed required community service at senior centers, apparently developed genuine interest in elder care issues, and now works in non-financial capacity with memory care residents at assisted living facility. This information, shared through overlapping professional connections rather than direct communication, suggested possibility of genuine rehabilitation rather than merely completed punishment. Whether his transformation reflected sincere values change or simply practical adaptation to closed professional avenues remained uncertain, but his continued work with vulnerable elders under appropriate supervision suggested potential redemptive dimension to otherwise troubling narrative. Does that bother you? Patricia inquired carefully. That he's working with vulnerable seniors after what he did? The question required thoughtful consideration rather than reflexive response. He works in supervised environment without access to residents' financial matters, I noted. And his experience, both attempting exploitation and facing consequences, potentially creates valuable perspective for recognizing concerning behaviors in others. This measured assessment reflected broader perspective developed throughout advocacy journey, recognition that effective prevention systems required input from multiple perspectives, including reformed offenders who understood exploitation dynamics from inside. Richard's exploitation attempt had catalyzed protective systems precisely because I transformed personal trauma into educational framework. Perhaps his subsequent experience with accountability could similarly contribute to prevention when properly channeled through appropriate supervisory structures. This capacity for nuanced assessment, neither minimizing serious violations nor precluding possibility of meaningful rehabilitation, represented personal growth that transcended initial shock and anger natural to betrayal experiences. The attorney who had sought justice had evolved into advocate who recognized complex human dimensions beyond binary categories of victim and perpetrator, incorporating restorative principles alongside accountability measures in comprehensive approach to elder justice. As the center's programming expanded throughout its inaugural year, I gradually shifted focus toward specific initiative that had emerged from advocacy experience, development of autonomy-enhancing support models for seniors experiencing health challenges. Too often, temporary health crises triggered permanent independence restrictions through well-intentioned but ultimately controlling interventions justified as protection. The critical gap in current systems, I explained during center planning meeting, is lack of flexible support models that provide necessary assistance during vulnerability periods without permanently restricting self-determination through excessive intervention. This initiative, developing graduated support protocols responsive to fluctuating capacity rather than imposing rigid control structures, represented evolution beyond exploitation prevention toward more comprehensive vision of elder justice that balanced essential protection with fundamental autonomy rights. Working with healthcare partners, we designed pilot program implementing transitional support systems following hospital discharge, precisely the vulnerability period I had exploited in my situation. The program provided intensive temporary assistance tapering gradually as recovery progressed, maintaining elders' decision-making authority throughout process rather than transferring control to others during vulnerability period. Early outcomes are extremely promising, reported Dr. Gonzalez, reviewing preliminary data from pilot implementation at 3 hospitals. Participants demonstrate significantly higher independence measures at 6 months post-discharge compared to control group receiving traditional care management, with equivalent safety outcomes and higher reported satisfaction. These results validated core principle underlying our approach, that protection-enhancing choice produced better outcomes than protection-restricting autonomy, even when measured by traditional safety metrics. Seniors receiving graduated support, maintaining their decision-making reported not only higher satisfaction, but also demonstrated better functional recovery than those subjected to more controlling interventions. 7 years after finding my possessions in garbage bags, I stood once again in the garden that had witnessed both traumatic beginning and transformative evolution of this unexpected life chapter. The autumn light illuminated heritage roses still blooming despite seasonal transition, their persistent flowering despite approaching winter, providing fitting metaphor for resilience themes, central to both personal recovery and public advocacy, developed throughout this journey. A documentary crew captured this reflective moment for educational film examining how individual trauma could catalyze systemic change when channeled into effective advocacy. The project, developed through partnership between the Center and National Public Broadcasting, would provide successor to original documentary series that had helped establish initial training programs years earlier. What would you identify as the most meaningful outcome from this 7-year journey? The director asked, as I tended plants that had survived both neglect during my absence and flourished during subsequent renewal. The question invited reflection, transcending specific policy achievements or institutional developments to identify essential meaning emerging from transformation of personal trauma into public purpose. After thoughtful consideration, my response emerged from integrated understanding of both individual healing and systemic change dimensions, that protection without autonomy isn't protection at all, and that systems truly serving elder welfare must enhance self-determination rather than restricting independence in the name of safety. The garbage bags represented an attempt to discard not just my possessions but my identity and agency. Our advocacy response created systems preserving both security and autonomy for vulnerable others who might otherwise face similar erasure. This fundamental principle, distinguishing between supportive protection and controlling intervention, had indeed become foundation for multi-layered reforms extending from local practices to national policy. The verification requirements, cooling-off periods, and enhanced accountability standards all served underlying purpose of ensuring elders' expressed preferences remained centered, rather than being overridden by others' judgments about appropriate decisions. As filming concluded, Patricia arrived with unexpected visitor, Commissioner Martinez, returning from Washington for Center Advisory Board meetings scheduled for following day. Their timing allowed private moment before larger gathering, would consume coming days with planning sessions and program reviews. Federal implementation guidelines are being finalized next month, Martinez reported as we settled in porch seating area overlooking garden that had witnessed this journey's beginning. The Thompson protocols have been incorporated intact. Verification, requirements, separate questioning standards, and cooling-off periods exactly as we designed them. This federal adoption, maintaining integrity of carefully calibrated protections developed through years of implementation refinement, represented significant victory ensuring consistent standards nationwide rather than piecemeal adaptation that might compromise effectiveness through insufficient understanding of underlying principles. The garbage bags have traveled quite distance, Martinez observed, referencing powerful visual symbol that remained central to training materials, despite years of program evolution and expansion. From your porch to national policy framework affecting millions of seniors. Indeed, those black plastic bags, intended to discard my identity and erase my presence from home earned through lifetime of work, had instead catalyzed protective systems extending far beyond individual circumstances to create national framework, preserving both security and dignity for vulnerable elders across diverse communities throughout the country. Later that evening, after visitors departed and twilight settled over garden that had witnessed both traumatic beginning and meaningful resolution of unexpected life chapter, I reflected on journey that had incorporated both professional expertise and personal vulnerability into uniquely effective advocacy platform. The attorney who had protected others' property rights throughout her career had ultimately needed to fight for her own home and dignity, emerging from that battle with expanded mission integrating legal knowledge and lived experience into compelling educational foundation for systemic change. My 80th birthday approached with confirmation that carefully designed transition plan would ensure Center's continued impact beyond my direct involvement. Dr. Gonzalez had demonstrated exceptional leadership as executive deputy, maintaining commitment to foundational principles while developing innovative applications, responding to emerging challenges and opportunities. The advisory board included diverse stakeholders representing all components of elder justice ecosystem, providing comprehensive perspective, transcending any individual viewpoint. Patricia and her family remained deeply engaged with Center's mission, their professional contributions ensuring family connection to institutional framework without creating inappropriate control or succession expectations. My grandsons, completing graduate studies in their respective fields, had developed professional identities incorporating elder justice principles without being defined exclusively by family advocacy history. Healthy integration of shared values within independent career paths. Most meaningfully, prevention outcomes data demonstrated tangible impact extending far beyond academic measures or policy achievements. Documented intervention cases, exploitation attempts interrupted before significant harm occurred, numbered in thousands across financial institutions implementing verification protocols nationwide. Healthcare systems reported improved discharge outcomes through vulnerability assessment programs, identifying potential exploitation risk before patients left protective hospital environments. These prevention statistics represented real elders, whose life savings remained secure, whose homes stayed under their control, whose dignity and autonomy continued uninterrupted because systems recognized and interrupted exploitation attempts before completion. Unlike the dramatic garbage bags that had catalyzed our advocacy journey, these prevention successes remained largely invisible. Exploitation attempts thwarted before creating traumatic outcomes requiring dramatic intervention. This prevention success, exploitation attempts stopped before creating victims requiring rescue, represented perhaps the most meaningful measure of our advocacy impact. The elder who never found possessions in garbage bags because exploitation attempt was interrupted during initial stages experienced security without trauma, protection without violation, outcome immeasurably superior to even the most effective. crisis response after exploitation had already occurred. As spring emerged following my 80th birthday, I implemented long-considered decision to transition from consulting directorship to emeritus advisory role, shifting primary leadership responsibility to Dr. Gonzalez while maintaining connection through specialized projects aligned with both expertise and energy capacity. This transition, neither complete disengagement nor unrealistic continuation, honored both meaningful contribution potential and practical limitations accompanying advancing years. The transition ceremony incorporated symbolic passage of leadership through presentation of institutional history book documenting center's development from initial advocacy response to established academic entity with national policy influence. My remarks acknowledged both progress achieved and challenges remaining in elder justice landscape that had evolved significantly, yet remained incomplete in addressing fundamental tensions between protection and autonomy across diverse community contexts. My deepest hope for the center's future, I concluded after thanking assembled colleagues, supporters, and family members, is continued commitment to essential principle that has guided our work from beginning, that true protection enhances, rather than diminishes autonomy, that dignity requires both security and self-determination, and that systems truly serving elder welfare must strengthen capacity for meaningful choice, rather than substituting others' judgment for elders' expressed preferences. Dr. Gonzalez's acceptance remarks honored this foundational vision while articulating forward-looking agenda incorporating emerging research, technology applications, and diverse community perspectives into evolving framework responsive to changing demographic realities and cultural contexts. Her leadership would maintain core principles while developing innovative applications, ensuring continued relevance and effectiveness in addressing exploitation dynamics that would inevitably evolve in response to established preventative systems. Following the ceremony, I lingered in garden that had witnessed complete arc of this unexpected life chapter. From traumatic injury that created vulnerability exploited by Richard, through crisis discovery of possessions in garbage bags, to development of advocacy platform that transformed personal trauma into systemic protection, benefiting countless others across expanding geographical reach. The heritage roses, propagated from cuttings shared decades earlier, had not merely survived periods of neglect and trauma, but had flourished through subsequent renewal. Producing more abundant blooms than before, crisis interrupted their tending. Their resilience provided fitting metaphor for journey that had incorporated both professional knowledge and personal vulnerability into singularly effective advocacy platform, creating protections extending far beyond individual circumstances. As twilight softened garden's edges, I found unexpected peace and transformation that had ultimately generated positive impact, far exceeding harm originally intended. The garbage bags meant to discard my identity had instead catalyzed renewed purpose transcending individual circumstances to create protective frameworks benefiting countless others who would never know specific details of exploitation attempt that launched this remarkable journey. What began as devastating betrayal had ultimately strengthened rather than destroyed my sense of agency and contribution, transforming victim narrative into survivor advocate journey, with impact exceeding anything I might have accomplished without experiencing exploitation's painful realities firsthand. The attorney who had spent career protecting others' property rights had ultimately needed to fight for her own home and dignity, emerging from that battle with expanded mission integrating professional expertise and personal experience into uniquely powerful advocacy platform. 8 years after finding my possessions in garbage bags, I could recognize with clarity that wasn't available during traumatic discovery moment, how crisis that might have remained simply painful violation had instead catalyzed meaningful purpose, extending beyond individual circumstances to create lasting legacy of protection for vulnerable others. The exploitation attempt intended to diminish my existence had paradoxically expanded my impact through advocacy platform that would continue protecting seniors long after direct involvement eventually concluded. The garbage bags on my porch hadn't represented ending but beginning of recovery journey incorporating both personal healing and public advocacy into integrated path forward. What exploitation attempted to erase, resilience had ultimately amplified, creating protection legacy extending far beyond individual circumstances to benefit vulnerable others through systems, policies, and educational frameworks that would continue evolving long after my direct involvement gradually diminished through natural life transition processes. This transformation, from exploitation target to recognized advocacy leader whose experience informed national policy, represented not just personal victory, but fundamental challenge to exploitation's dehumanizing intent. The very vulnerability experiences that exploiters targeted as weakness had ultimately created powerful platform for educational work, strengthening protective systems on multiple levels. In this transformation lay perhaps most profound response to exploitation's destructive intent, not just recovering what was nearly taken, but creating from that experience protective legacy, extending to countless others who would never know my name, but whose dignity and security would be preserved. Through systems catalyzed by garbage bags that failed to accomplish their intended erasure of my identity, independence, and fundamental human worth. As darkness settled over garden that had witnessed both traumatic beginning and meaningful resolution of unexpected life chapter, I found deep contentment in knowledge that temporary vulnerability had ultimately generated lasting strength, not just for personal recovery, but for systemic protection extending to vulnerable others across nation. The garbage bags meant to discard my existence had instead launched journey creating protection for countless seniors who would never experience similar trauma, precisely because systems developed from my experience would interrupt exploitation attempts before completion. In this prevention legacy, exploitation attempts thwarted before creating victims requiring rescue, lay perhaps the most meaningful measure of advocacy journey that transformed personal trauma into public purpose, extending far beyond individual circumstances to create lasting protection for vulnerable others. What began with garbage bags had culminated in comprehensive systems, ensuring other seniors would never face similar indignity. Transformation of personal violation into public protection that represented most profound possible response to exploitation's destructive intent. The most meaningful victory wasn't just reclaiming what exploitation attempted to take, but ensuring others would never face similar violation. Legacy extending far beyond personal circumstances to create protective systems benefiting countless vulnerable seniors who would never know the garbage bags that ultimately saved them from experiencing similar trauma in their own lives. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.